We'd like to welcome everybody to the Really American Podcast. I am your host, Chip Franklin, and with me today is one of my favorite people to talk to, and that is the managing editor. Is that your at the Nation? What do we call you?
I think I am referred to as the national correspondent.
That's it, national correspondent. I'm sorry,
John. Political writer.
And John has a new book out called Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers, Accountability for Those Who Caused the Crisis. We will get to that because have you read Michael Lewis's book?
Oh, yeah.
The Premonition, yeah.
Which I tell him, quite good, although this is a very different take.
Sure.
Some of the same.
Well, his is more about public health workers, and yours is more about the
very bad people,
the incompetence, and the loss of life because of it. So let's talk about this because this is honestly one of the questions I get asked all the time. In fact, the Washington Post did a piece and they interviewed me and they asked me about, as a talk show host, essentially what's wrong with the Democrats and what's wrong with the CDC. And I said, I feel like I'm swimming in the ocean at night. I could be 100 yards from shore or I could be 100 miles. I just don't know, but I got to keep swimming. The Democratic Party, I saw Kamala Harris on the Today Show today, and she was not good. The president has and the CDC have had these mixed messages. It doesn't really bother me, John, that their messaging is tough on COVID because COVID is tough and trying to predict, where it is, everything from, PPEs to shots to information. I just look at a bigger picture here and I look at since George Floyd, the mishandling of that messaging. Let me just ask you a real basic question. What's wrong with the Democratic Party?
A lot. Look, here's the bottom line with the Democratic Party. It is not one party. There are many, many factions within it. And it isn't just Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema versus everybody else. There's a lot of gradations within it. This is a political party that, because of what it's been up against since George W. Bush, so it's a long time now, because of what it's been up against and because that other side, if you will, has been so daunting, so threatening, the party has sort of organized itself around being not as bad as the other guys, right? It's being the alternative to the bad guys. That works politically until you get power. But once you get power, then you've got to be the guys, right? You've got to be the team that's actually doing the job. And unfortunately, they're not coherent on when they get power on what they want to do with it. Now, in contrast, like it or not, the Republicans know what they're going to do. They are going to lower taxes for rich people, which they right out of the bat did. They're going to appoint extreme conservative judges, which they right out of the bat did. And they're generally going to try and, have sort of a laissez-faire approach to a lot of business-oriented issues. That's the truth. That's what they're going to do. And the problem with Democrats is you have folks within the Democratic camp who go all the way from, passionate socialists over to folks who are a little hard to distinguish from the Republicans on a lot of those economic issues, especially.
But what about the messaging? From wokeness, terrible messaging from just the defund the police to right now today. Here's a great example of what's wrong. I think there's a story that keeps going on and on about trans athletes defeating girls in swimming or some sort of sports, right? I have strong opinion about that. That is probably closer aligned to maybe yours and some others on the left, and that is that this is not the end of the world. Okay, if my daughter was swimming in these events and losing to a trans person, I'd say be proud that you're part of this. This is something that is
historic moment.
It's a nuanced moment, I know everybody wants the statues on the shelves and the ribbons and everything like that, but it doesn't always work like that. But
my daughter, if I can give you just a quick example, my daughter plays high school volleyball, and she's a really good player. She's very tall. A lot of things go in her favor in that regard. She lucked out in some ways as somebody who wants to play volleyball. I talked to her about it. It was, it was on the radio one day, and we had a long discussion about it. And she was like, no, I think it's great. Right. I mean, that's just.
She's your kid.
Well, but she's also a product of her generation. And I think not everybody, I'm sure, but an awful lot of these young athletes, girls and boys, and everybody else they know full well that what a trans person goes through, right? And all the challenges and all of the broader realities. And I think they're very conscious of that. And so they see courage there. They see, somebody who's really striving. And at the end of the day, this is a manufactured controversy, right? This is a controversy manufactured by the right.
Partly there's some real. I mean,
there are some real challenges, but it is amplified to a level that is way beyond where the real concerns are. Again, I come from a family with a lot of people in high school sports, right? Unless I bring it up, this issue doesn't come up. Period. Right. It does not come up unless I'm saying, well, what do you think about this? And I want to really emphasize that. And frankly, an awful lot of what goes on with the schools, and this is to keep to your messaging question, an awful lot of what goes on with the schools is something that the Republicans are very good at. They figured out that they can speak about specific issues, not because of those issues, but because they touch on a broader anxiety among parents about education, about their kids, about what the future is going to look like. And I think that's certainly what Glenn Youngkin did in Virginia. I think that is what a lot of Republican politicians do is they scratch the wound, right? They put a little salt in. They find a way to talk about it that gets people hyped up and concerned and worried. And I have seen, relatively liberal parents who end up voting for a conservative candidate because they're worried about broader challenges with the schools or broader challenges in society. So it's a smart strategy on the Republican side.
Without a doubt.
Yeah. The Democratic problem is that the Democrats aren't comfortable doing the two-step absolutely required response. The first step is to say, I want to make it clear why we're talking about this. Consultants sat around and said that if this Republican candidate talks about these things, that will scare you enough to think about voting for them, right? That there's a strategy here, and you need to understand that strategy. But I'm not going to just leave it there. I'm not going to, just like blame and point a finger. I'm going to tell you that up front because you need to know it. Now, let me also talk about this issue and let me go deeper into it. And that combination of sort of leveling with people about what politics is these days and then giving them a good, clear, honest answer, that's the way to deal with this. But so often Democrats do one of two things. Sometimes they give the good, clear, honest answer, but it's out of context, and that doesn't work. Or other times they just point a finger of blame at the Republicans and say, oh, those are horrible people saying awful things. You got to have both elements of this to begin that deeper conversation with people. And if I can just close with one element here, to give you an example of, when a lot of our Republican friends have been going after critical race theory, right? And saying, wow, this is a terrible thing. I think the answer to that is to come back very, very clearly and say, I want my kid to have a full education about, the goods and the bads and the challenges of this country. I want my child to be able to compete, in a global workforce that is not going to accept someone who is ignorant or ill-informed about the story of the United States or the story about other countries around the world. And but I've seen people do that, and it's worked.
But you took, 7-8 minutes there.
I know. And we got to get it down to a minute.
The Republican Party's going to come out and say that they want to take the medals from your daughter. They're going to come out and say that everybody white is a racist according to the Democratic Party. They're going to say that that we should be ashamed because, I mean, critical race theory is probably the most misunderstood, in my opinion, approach to, the past, allowing it to be, called this. What it is U.S. history. I mean, why don't we just call it that? Why don't we just say this is U.S. history? Kids should understand U.S. history. They should understand, the slave trade, the Middle Passage, Tulsa, everything. They should understand. And the reason they should understand it is so they can be better equipped to deal with what could come in the future. Because whatever, past is prologue, and we know that. We've seen it, right?
Absolutely.
By the way, we're talking. We're talking about who we're talking to. We're talking to John Nichols right now. He is a national correspondent for The Nation. He has a new book out called Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers. We'll get to that in a minute. Right now, we're talking about the state of the Democratic Party. How bad will they lose in 2022?
Well, if they keep on the track that they are on, right. They could lose very, very badly. And that's an important thing to understand. First, there's a couple of elements here that we need to put into play. First and foremost, midterm elections are lousy for the party in power. The history is very strong on that. And that's, Democrats love that when there's a Republican in power, right? I mean, 2018 was pretty horrible for the Republicans all over the country.
This is a different time, John. This is a different time. Obviously, there's a good chance that a Republican House will impeach Joe Biden.
Look, I'm not underestimating that. I'm giving you just laying the groundwork here, right? Midterms are bad. You asked how bad they're going to lose. Midterms are bad, right? So unless you alter the dynamic, unless you get control of the narrative and take it someplace else, you are on balance likely to lose, and potentially pretty badly. So that's number one. Number two, the Democratic Party is on a losing streak right now, right? Build Back Better kind of fell apart. They're now doing a big effort on democracy, but it doesn't look like it's going very well, at least today. COVID, which was their issue, right? Give us power and we're going to take care of this thing. We've got Omicron. It isn't their fault, but boy, it's rolling over them, and they've got all the challenges with schools and everything that goes on. So that combination, right, that it's going to be bad anyway. You got a lot of, you're not looking very good. And finally, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, bless them, but they're not the greatest communicators. They're not. And so the end result is that the Democratic Party at this point has sort of three strikes against it. Unless they harness this moment and really kind of pull all the pieces together and move in a very different direction than where they're going right now, they are likely to lose. They could well, I shouldn't say likely, I'll say they could well lose the House, the Senate, and a group of governorships and secretaries of state positions around the country that would create then the scenario you worry about, which is not merely that they might try to impeach Biden, but much more seriously, that they would be set up for a 2024 presidential election in which they control all the levers of power as regards election rules and exception of election results.
Let me show you some of the messaging we're getting right now. This is from Gabriel. Trump Republicans are the enemy. They only care about money and power. This is another one. Biden is ill with dementia. He is not making any sense right now. Now, when I see that, we'll get to that in a second. I know you and I both disagree with, obviously, but here's another one. Name one thing that Trump did that was good before coming president. See, this all comes back, again, to Trump. And I think that we're getting hundreds of messages here. Mm-hmm. I think that the Democrats are anxious. They want, again, Kamala Harris was horrible on the Today Show today. I don't understand how people can be so bad at explaining their positions. You just nailed it. You were pretty simple about it. I mean, if somebody came to me and said, New Green Deal, and I'd say, have you paid attention to the last 5 years were the hottest on record in the world? That we're going to lose a big section of the Midwest, the central part of the country, of the globe, will become unlivable. People will be, and this is all in the next century in our grandchildren's lives.
Look, and it's moving, and now it's moving faster.
But hold on. But that's my point, John. There's instead of, we're playing. we're tiptoeing. I mean, when we talk about somebody says, defund the police, I say, shut up. We're not going to defund the police. We need cops. We don't need bad cops. We need to get rid of bad cops. We need to train them better. They should speak forcefully like I do right now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, instead of saying, well, and I get it. Biden has never been a great speaker, and that's not why he was elected. He was elected because he was sanity facing, 45's immoral trek through the last 5 years and just a horrible period of our lives. I think I'm speaking for a lot of people that are listening right now that are Democrats saying, why aren't we more aggressive with our message?
Well, I mean, to be aggressive with your message, you have to know what your message is. It's a very, very vital reality. Like, you tell me, if you're arguing with somebody and you know exactly where you're arguing from, you're very confident in where you're coming from, you've maybe done it before, you do it because you're in talk radio, you do it a lot, right? You're very comfortable with it, you're going to do fine. You're going to, whatever angle comes up, you'll do fine. But if you're struggling with where you want to be at, and it isn't that you necessarily don't have the values, it isn't necessarily that you don't, have the general sense of what you want to do, but if you're struggling with the clarity on it, you're going to screw up, right? It just isn't going to work. And the other side, the other folks who are, as we say, pretty good at messaging, they're going to do very well. When I cover political events on both sides, right? I've been to Republican conferences and Republican state chairs conferences and things like that. They never get up at the start and say, let's debate an issue. Let's talk about abortion rights, or let's talk about the economy. No. Their entire thing, the whole event is, how do we message this stuff? How do we sell, what we're pushing? And they will often subtly acknowledge that what they're selling isn't popular. And so it's like, how do we sell something that's unpopular, right? And they really work on that messaging.
Well, they're good at fear. They're good at stoking fear. That's what
Democrats actually debate themselves all the time, right? And as a result, and I love the debate, I encourage it. But at the end of the day, when you have power, when you've got the presidency, the House, and the Senate, no matter how narrow the majorities are, and I know that, at the end of the day, when you get to that next election, that midterm or the presidential, excuses will not cut it. It doesn't work. It does not work. You have to govern. And if you can't govern, then what you're going to be up against is people saying, well, we gave you the key to the kingdom and you didn't know what to do with it. And so for Biden, Harris, Schumer, Pelosi, and others, and I think maybe Pelosi's best at this, but for all of them, and as well as Bernie Sanders and others, they need to, I would suggest, get in a room and say, what's our focus going forward? And is it going to be that we're going to be the party that masters COVID? Not a bad message, right?
Right.
That's fine. And then you can run a lot of stuff through that. Are they going to be the party that does, you pick your zone, you pick your territory, and then you go forward on that, and you have a united message. They could have won Build Back Better if they had done that back in July of last summer, but they didn't. They let
parse it up into pieces that people can understand. I mean,
right.
It's a Build Back Better sounds, it sounds great, but I mean, you have to tell people, the average child care in an American home is $2,300 a month, which is a mortgage in a good chunk of America. That's unsustainable. Community college is an investment.
Sorry, Chip, how can you lose on giving the elderly vision, hearing, and dental care?
Right. No.
How can you fail on that? I don't even know.
You have to do. I mean, the best orators will anecdotally bring it to people. They'll show a person who's been denied and say, "This is America, and this is what you're doing to America."
Right.
But I think though that one of the big things too about critical race theory that people don't understand is this idea that middle class white people are being told that they're racist just for being alive and being white, And I mean, there's a lot of problems in this country, but we shouldn't be telling people that they're racist just because they're white. I mean,
and you know what? With all due respect, I have friends who developed critical race theory. I know people that were actively involved in it, and I've been on panels with them. I've been in debates and discussions with them. We haven't always agreed on everything. I have never, for a second, felt uncomfortable with the dialogue. I mean, look. The simple fact of the matter is that a false construct has been created, right? A lie
right.
has been put out there, and one of the things that I think that I think is a responsibility is to step up and say, not to say, be apologetic about it, right? And that's one of the worst things in a debate is to come on apologetic, right? You seem weak there. I think you come on and you say, look, critical race theory is a term. It's an academic term in graduate school and law school and places like that. Let's bring it down to reality. Do you think that 400 years of slavery, segregation, discrimination across all that time, that had no effect? Because that's what the people who are attacking critical race theory want you to believe. They want you to believe that had no impact on our laws, that had no impact on our structures, on our economics, on our politics. And I'm going to say, honestly, of course it did. And so instead of denying that, why don't we tell the true story of America, the great story of America that founded in original sin, the acceptance of human bondage? This country, through immense struggle and immense suffering, saw off human bondage, and then had the horrible reality of segregation and Jim Crow segregation in the South and other forms of segregation in the North. And because of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin and others, and so many people who stepped up courageously and fought these battles, we changed our laws, and we continue to struggle to get that right. It has never been easy, but the fact of the matter is, it's a story of a country that actually has progressed, and where people given power can address fundamental issues. And I think I think I could get, in fact, I have done it with rural and conservative audiences to get them applauding patriotically for the progress of this country toward voting rights and toward, a better realization of what we ought to be.
Do you think there's a problem in your approach, and that we're talking to John Nichols, who is national correspondent for The Nation. He has a new book out called Coronavirus Criminals. We'll get to that in a second. You're an intellectual. And I mean that as a compliment, although it's often used as pejorative.
Right? Is it not? Yeah.
Yeah. And you give nuanced answers. Okay.
It can be a problem. Yep.
Yeah, it's a huge problem.
But I'll tell you this. I grew up in Union Grove, Wisconsin, population 970 when I was born. Union Grove voted for Trump. I've got relatives, in-laws, voted for Trump. I spend a lot of my time with people who are skeptical about climate change, who've been skeptical about vaccines. And I can tell you that I grew up learning to talk to the folks, right?
Yeah.
And I don't claim to be great at it at all, but I think I'm okay at talking to somebody who disagrees with me or who has skepticism, who's uncertain, and trying to, suss them out, get a sense of them, and speak to them. And you do speak, sometimes more aggressively, sometimes more gently, sometimes with subtlety, sometimes without. And it's knowing your audience. It's knowing who you're talking to. I'm talking to you. I know you know all these issues, right? I know you're on top of these things. I will often find myself with somebody who isn't following the news every day or isn't tuning into CNN and everything every night or whatever. And sometimes I think the best thing you can do in messaging, right, is to ask people questions, right? Ask them about themselves, ask them where they're at, and then find the thing where you can actually talk to one another, initially at least, to build that trust. And I know that in rural areas, I'll often talk about farm prices or the weather, right? Because these things matter a lot especially to farmers. And then you sort of start to get that conversation going, and then you could go a lot deeper. It's a question of how much time you want to take to actually get there with people. And I think that there are some folks on the Democratic side who are unwilling to take that time because it is demanding. But in politics, some of the best political figures I've ever seen, and I would count maybe at the top of the list would be Paul Wellstone. Wellstone would go right into those rural areas, right into those small towns.
This is the former senator from Minnesota, right?
Yeah. Yep. And he was a little Jewish guy, right? He was a college professor, as he would say it. And he went out there into rural Minnesota and he built deep relationships with people who were often very different than him. And if I can tell you, I'll tell you a really quick story, very quick one. And I knew Paul really well. He was very involved in the farm crisis in the 1980s, trying to build urban-rural coalitions to protect family farmers who were losing their land because of big ag and stuff like that. And the neo-Nazis came into that movement in that period. Not the part that Wellstone was in, but they were infiltrating a lot and they were trying to stir up anger among the farmers. And his wife, Sheila, said, I'm getting really uncomfortable with you driving out late at night on winter nights to these small towns and going to these meetings with these farmers. I'm really ill at ease. And Paul said, well, yeah, but I got to do it. We're at such a critical point in this struggle. And I've got to be out there to counter what the Nazis are saying, counter what these bad folks are saying. And he went out a few days later to an event in a small town. And it was in a tavern. And he was standing on a pool table or something, talking to a crowd of farmers and talking about the coalitions they got to build and the things they got to do. And then, the event ended and Paul was always the last person out of a room. He talked to everybody there. He took the time and he went out in the parking lot. There's a dimly lit parking lot outside a tavern on a winter night. And as he walked toward his car, a guy stepped out of the shadows. It was about Paul's maybe 5'5". This guy stepped out of the shadows, was about 6'8". Just this huge, tall, very strong, burly kind of guy. And he came up to him and he said, "You Wellstone?" And Paul said, "Yeah, I am." And he says, "That's a Jewish name." And Paul said, Paul had been a wrestler. So, he's kind of gets a little bit tight up and he goes, "Yeah, what is it to you?" Right. And the guy sticks his hand out and says, "Oh, hey, no trouble, man. I'm Finnish. We minorities got to stick together."
Yeah. A couple things I wanted to run by you real quick. The Quinnipiac poll of Biden having him in the low 30s is an outlier. Most of the other polling actually has him in the 40s, which people talk about a lot. But the other thing that Biden said that I wanted to run by you here, and then I do want to talk about the book, is that Biden compared those Republicans who had a problem with the Voting Rights Act to Bull Connor and to the Southern militia who attacked African-American protesters with, billy clubs and dogs and water cannons. And I thought that was ill-advised. I do think again, I've actually read the Voting Rights Act. I would imagine that there probably is some room on that we could, I think it was Romney that said, in essence, they were telling states, how to be able to run their elections. Is there a chance that maybe the Democratic Party is overreacting and that we still will get fair balloting in these states, these 5 states especially that we worry about? That I saw this on Rachel last night, that had turned in these lists of fake electors. Now that we know what happened in 2020, is it possible that without the Voting Rights Act, we can still get a fair and free election in the mids and in the national election 2024?
It's a very good question. Yeah, theoretically you can. I've known Jesse Jackson for a long time, and it's very interesting. I'll often be on radio shows. I do the Reverend's radio show a lot, and we'll often be on the show like the weekend before an election. And one of the things he'll say is, "Well, don't talk too much about how hard it is, right? Don't talk too much about how bad it is, because you want people to actually go out and do it, and to surmount those barriers, to surmount those challenges, as many have been erected." And because the Republicans have unquestionably been erecting barriers, doing voter suppression, trying to make it harder. There's been a lot of preparation for that, right? People are aware of some of the challenges. So at the heart of the answer to your question it's like a quick two-part of it. Number one, can you do it without a Voting Rights Act? Theoretically, yeah, I think it can. But where you can't do it is if the officials who are overseeing the process are putting their thumb on the scale in place after place after place to make it impossible or overwhelmingly hard. And what I mean by that,
a huge assumption that Republicans, that you have to have a lot of people for that kind of cheating to happen, right?
No, it's not cheating. No. I'm talking about how many machines do you put into a polling place, right? If you know you're going to have a very high turnout there,
so people have to wait for hours in line.
Exactly. Yeah. Do you have people waiting 8, 9, 10 hours? And then do you really enforce these laws that they're passing in some places that bar anyone from bringing them water, right? And so you're asking somebody, an elderly person, to stand in line for 8 hours without water, right?
I love the argument the Republicans give against that. They're saying that you're rewarding people for voting by giving them water.
or stale pizza and some water. Look, the bottom line though is, so that's the two-part, that's the kind of nuanced answer. And I go, you're getting on me for being nuanced here, but
I'm not. I believe we need more nuance, not less.
Yeah, I know. But you know what I'm saying is, so look, here's the thing about Biden that I think he could do much better on. I don't think it's wrong to call things out in blunt terms and to say, this is starting to look an awful lot like what we fought against in the 60s. I think that's okay. But if that's your whole message and your only message, you're not going to get as far as you want to get. I think there still has to be a positive message about the progress this country has made. You ought to try and make people proud of the fact that we've made it steadily easier to vote in this country historically, that we started as a country where about 4 or 5% of people could vote, and we got up to a point where most of us can vote, right? And so I would like to see Biden do a little more of the warm embrace of democracy and the warm embrace of it to try and touch people's hearts there as much as, just to make them angry.
You're listening to a Really American Podcast. Chip Franklin with John Nichols, national correspondent for The Nation, has a new book out called Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers. Let me go into the book with this question, and I don't mean to be adversarial, but more people died in 2021 from COVID than died in 2020 under a Democratic president that said he would corral it. What went wrong?
Oh, well, I mean, let me take it right out of the COVID thing and take it to a broader sense. There were points during Franklin Roosevelt's presidency where people suffered as much or more from the Great Depression as before Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. So you can get in charge of a problem and not necessarily make it go away or even reduce it, right? That's a reality. But why did people love Roosevelt? Because they knew he was trying, right? They knew he was on top of it, and not always succeeding, but at least doing everything he could to try and find the solution. And famously, Roosevelt used to go in a room and say, "What are your ideas?" And there'd be 10 ideas, and he'd say, "Let's do that, and that." And people would say, "Well, what do you mean?" And he says, "We don't know what the answer is. We're going to try as hard as we can till we get there." So Biden can have space for not getting everything right, and you could say to him, you look, things are worse in some cases, or at least they're overwhelming in some cases. And you say, yeah, I inherited a huge problem, and you don't immediately solve that problem. But with that said, Chip, and this is a tough thing to say, but it's an important thing to say. I think the Biden administration took its eye off the prize for some of the period in 2021. And what I mean by that is that, like you and like me, I don't know, I shouldn't speak for you, but I'll speak for myself. You got into that summer of 2021, it was starting to look a lot better, right?
Sure.
And I actually went to concerts, right? Which is, it's something in 2020 I couldn't even imagine doing. And so a lot of us started to loosen up, and we started to think, okay, we've come to a new place, right? It's gotten better. We may still have to wear our mask in some situations, but things have really substantially improved. We can go to a dinner party. We can, we're vaccinated, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
And what the thing that the Biden administration should have been doing during that period, I mean, it should have been anticipating where we've ended up, right, with Omicron and stuff like this. They had to, and so there were things that needed to be done that I would have liked to have seen them not, and I don't think there was any, bad intent here at all. I think it was just, hope. And I think sometimes they let hope overwhelm, the logical concern that they should have had. And so where I say that especially is they should have been renegotiating those vaccine contracts with the pharmaceutical companies, which are profiteering at a level that would make your jaw drop, right?
Really?
And
Moderna, Pfizer are
unbelievable. They're making Pfizer and Moderna and BioNTech are making $1,000 a second, $65,000 a minute profit off these vaccines. It's just astronomical, and yet they're refusing to bend to the basic demands of not just the United States, but countries around the world to make these vaccines more accessible and to kind of keep evolving as we need to. And so, I mean, we need to get Biden, I think, should have made it a priority to get, on top of that early on, not just to bend to the vaccine companies, but to really, or pharmaceutical companies, but really get on top of it. I think also there was a need to get way on top of the supply chain as regards the things that we need, testing, masks, all of these other things, so that we have a real control of it. Now, what if he had done all that and then we didn't get Omicron, that it Christmas, everything turned out great and we didn't have a problem? Well, I'm sorry. You would have had, you would have stocked up a lot of supplies. You would have, dotted a lot of I's, crossed a lot of T's, and it wasn't necessary. He'd be a lot better off right now had that happened.
Okay. You and I were talking before the show, I believe it was before the show, about Michael Lewis's book, Premonition, which is about public health workers and the tremendous jobs, or what they tried to do under the Trump administration. Although the book really wasn't as critical as Trump as it was just about, showing just the power a public health worker can have.
It's a positive in many ways.
If Hillary Clinton had been president in 2016, and inherited this pandemic, as opposed to Trump, I'm of the belief we'd have hundreds of thousands of more people alive today.
Totally.
Than then. Do you agree?
Oh, without a doubt. Without a doubt. The Lancet, and I write about this in the book a lot. The Lancet study that was a commission that looked at all these issues suggested that roughly 40% of the deaths from coronavirus in 2020, mainly in 2020, kind of moving into 2021, could have been avoided. So that's almost half right there. Right. Deborah Birx,
maybe 300 plus thousand people.
A huge amount of people. And then, Dr. Birx, who was the White House point person on these issues after Trump was gone, and she was interviewed, said that, and I'm paraphrasing here, but after the first 100,000 deaths, we should have been able to dramatically reduce the number of deaths. Like, we should have been on top of it enough. And so she's actually pointing to an even bigger number potentially that could have been saved. Well, and then we're only talking about the U.S. We go beyond our borders, which, remember, of course, comes back and hits us. Astronomical numbers of deaths could have been avoided globally if Mike Pompeo and other people had not, frankly, played Cold War dumb politics with these issues. I mean, withdrawing from the WHO and things like that. So, I mean, the bottom line is, and I write about this a lot in the book, there's simply no question that there are people who died that did not have to die. And in the book, I have 18 chapters, 18 essays, basically, on different individuals who had power, either in politics or in the economy, who didn't do what they should have done, or who profiteered off this. And in most of those chapters, I don't start with that individual. I start with someone who died. And then I try to look at, why did this person die? Was it simply dumb luck of getting the disease? Or were there people in positions of power who failed them, who did not do what they could have and should have done? And the fact of the matter is, it's pretty easy to identify those cases where not just Donald Trump, but CEOs of major companies, governors, including a couple Democrats, really failed people.
I think about you talking about profiteering, and I remember in the early days hearing some of the people in Congress who shorted stock or
They were sitting there on their phones during committee meetings, right? Looking at stock numbers. So it's just there's no question that those are the bad players. But you know what, Chip? Those are actually the low-level bad players, right? They're I look at somebody like Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner was put in charge of the supply chain in the spring of 2020. It was his job to make sure that we got PPE. He set up such an absolutely convoluted mess of a system that it actually fell apart. It literally collapsed in a couple of months. They stopped doing it. It was under investigation within weeks, actually. And the bottom line was Jared Kushner, who's a fool, right? Who basically everything he touches falls apart.
That's a nice way of characterizing Jared Kushner.
Yes, I know it's a generous way. But the bottom line is he was incompetent, and he was the person who was in charge at a critical stage. Mike Pence, and again, I'm not just picking on Republicans here, but they do stand out. Mike Pence wrote a piece. He wrote an essay for the Wall Street Journal in June of 2020, in which he basically said that we don't have a new wave of this stuff coming. It's fine. We're all great, right? Within weeks, you started to have like new peaks of the problem, and these were people who were incompetent and they didn't care. And then in some cases, like Trump, they were actually deliberately lying to the American people at the time when the American people desperately needed the truth. Yeah. And so that's the political side. On the corporate side, look, you had, there's never been a better year for billionaires than 2020 and 2021. These have been epic years for very, very rich people to get dramatically richer. And there's something wrong with a national crisis where we ask working class people to risk their lives to take care of us in hospitals, to get us the food we need, right? And then somehow somebody who's at their second or third home, sitting, in their luxury setting, and that person in their second or third home ends up billions of dollars richer.
Yeah, talking about John Nichols from The Nation. I mean, you look at the people that disproportionately died, people of color, poor people, the comorbidities because of the food deserts that they live in, yep. and the diabetes. It just goes on and on and on. And the fact that, we haven't continued to bring that up. If I were the Democrats, I mean, I would talk about race. I would talk about COVID. I would talk about economic disparities. But I would do it in a way that offered hope and promise. And the hope and promise is under progressive principles.
Absolutely.
I totally agree that. And then I can make the case, I mean, it takes a little bit of time, but I can make the case saying that, simply that the people that are at the bottom, that fall through the cracks that Adam Smith referred to in Theory of Moral Sentiments, the people that we forget about in capitalism are the thing that will kill capitalism. It doesn't hurt when we help them. We help capitalism, and we do because we have more people for businesses to sell things to, and they can hire more people. It's just, this goes back to my question about what the fuck is wrong with the Democratic Party and this message.
Well, you just nailed a part of it, the economic side, in a very upbeat. Actually, despite your employment of an obscenity there, toward the end of it. No, I'm using you, but let's talk about the moral side too, because one of the things that people need is sort of a moral grounding, a sense. And there are most of the world's great religions will tell you that you begin with the least of these, right? You figure out that if you're going to try and build a functional society, right, you got to take care of those who are not advantaged, right? That is a practical reality. It's also a moral reality. And that's how you measure a good society. Hubert Humphrey, always said that, it's like you don't look You don't look at a society and say, how are the rich people doing, right? You look at a society and say, how are the poorest people doing? How are the elderly doing? How are those who are ill? How are the people who are in the shadows? How are they doing? And the fact of the matter is that during the pandemic, and frankly, since the pandemic, we've had a radical redistribution of the wealth upwards. We have asked for massive sacrifices from working class people and from poor people. We have asked them to deliver our food, right? To be out there at night on a cold night, going into restaurants, going into all sorts of places and to get us our food. We have asked them to show up at hospitals and work, not just the nurses and doctors, but the people who clean the hospitals, right? Think of the real frontline challenges there. We have asked them to drive our buses and to do our mass transit in the middle of the night. One of the things I write about in the book is Elaine Chao, Mitch McConnell's wife, who became Secretary of Transportation. Yeah, through no nepotism at all, I'm sure. But she became Secretary of Transportation under Trump. Throughout 2020, she refused to issue a national mandate for mask wearing on public transportation, which with interstate commerce and things like that, she had a lot of flexibility to do this. People begged her to do it. They treated her seriously. They treated her as a person in power who they could make appeals to. The unions went to her. Public health people went to her. She refused to do it throughout the year. Now, that was good for the people who own transportation companies. In some cases, it was, a baseline profiteering. It might have been good. It was terrible. People died because Elaine Chao refused to do a basic order that would have protected all sorts of folks. And you can find that again and again and again. And that is a society that's not working. That's not functioning when you won't do those basic things.
John Nichols, national correspondent for The Nation. His new book is called Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers. Again, just remember Coronavirus Criminals. I think this kind of sells it up. Hillary would have never shut down the pandemic response team in China that Obama set up. It could have been caught. 28. I've done this many times with people. So
she wouldn't have withdrawn from the WHO.
Well, when the people from the Beijing embassy came to the Wuhan Virology Institute, and they saw they were invited to watch their study of the transmissibility between novel coronaviruses and bats. They were freaked out. They cabled Washington and said, we need to help them. They were ignored. I mean, this is all part of history. And I'm sure history will not be kind. But right now, what everybody's worried about, and I'll let you go here in a second, but everybody's worried about 2022. And again, if we lose, again, Ann right here kind of says it right. I can't say it any better. Our vote is in jeopardy. If it goes and the Republic goes, do something. What can we do to protect our vote today?
Yeah, well, look, there's a lot that can be done at the state level. I'm afraid at the federal level, it's not looking very good. I understand what Chuck Schumer and others are trying to do. I understand what Joe Biden, Joe Biden at the start of this week gave the speech that he should have given a year ago, right? It was actually a very, very good speech in a lot of ways.
I agree.
But that's the speech you start with, not the speech you give at, the last moment, before things fall apart. And so we've had a lot of doors closed to us at the federal level. There's still a lot of places at the state level that interventions can be made. And wherever possible, every effort should be made to make it easy to vote. I know that we get so much bad news. We just got tremendous news out of Ohio, where the Ohio State Supreme Court overturned terribly gerrymandered maps and made possible much fairer elections there. And you're going to find there's a push and pull all over the country. One of the mistakes that is made, and I do this as somebody who writes about national politics a lot, I always tell people, our politics operates on 3 levels: local, state, national, right? And you want to protect the right to vote, you find your interventions along that chain. You intervene at the local level where possible, at the state level where possible, at the national level where possible. And if the governmental side lets you down, then you do not give up, because this is too critical a moment. Then you intervene at the electoral side, at the political side, and you do everything you can to make sure that it is possible for people to vote, to get to the polls, to overcome barriers and limits. The answer to this thing is to not give up to despair, right? But to understand something that the great philosopher and thinker Rebecca Solnit says. Ask yourself why the other side is fighting so hard. Why are they so determined to erect barriers, to gerrymander, to do all of these things? It is because they know they cannot win fairly. And so understand that you are on the part of the majority. You are on the side that has the advantage of its numbers here. Your job is to make sure that those numbers are tabulated, counted, and recorded. Make sure that people turn out and that you get a result that's based off that. It will not be easy in 2022, but that's basically what you have to do.
I'm reminded of the old Churchill quote: Americans, after exhausting all the other possibilities, will always do the right thing. I hope that that's true, because it seems to me that, I mean, I apologize for the obscenity, but
I'm teasing you. Yeah,
I know you are, and I try not to do it. My mother would have been 100 on January the 8th, and she died in the middle of COVID, and I couldn't see her. So it's personal for me, and it's personal for a lot of people listening and watching this right now. When is the book available? Can I get it on Amazon now?
Well, it certainly makes a fine holiday gift, but you have to wait. You can go on Amazon. You go other places. I love supporting our local independent bookstores. It publishes on January 25th. So it's got we got a couple weeks before the formal pub date. And, but what I can tell you is we've had a remarkable response to it. And I would love to tell you it's because I'm such a perfect writer. I can tell you I'm very flawed and I make mistakes and blah, blah, blah. I think that why people have responded so well is because they know something went wrong. They know that that in 2020 especially, that it could have been better. And that's what this book argues. A, it could have been better. B, we need to hold the people to account who made it worse. And C, we need to learn from that so that we never get ourselves in a similar situation in the future. And believe me, what I've learned in writing this book about viruses and about, COVIDs and, all these different threats, we will be in this situation again. The real question is whether we learn from it. And that's what I seek to do with the book.
Well, I can't wait to read it. And as always, I enjoyed the time with you. I know you're busy and you got a lot of this going on. Please stay well, and we'll talk to you again soon, John. Okay?
Chip, it's an honor to be on with you. Thanks for having me.
Always. It's mine, buddy. You be well. Okay. We'll talk to you again soon. Again, the book, Thanks to God. That is, of course, the one and only John Nichols, who is the national correspondent for The Nation. I'm Chip Franklin. Thank you for spending your time with us on this today. We do this a couple times a week. We're going to be doing a little more of this. I'm excited about some of the guests coming up in the near future. Famous people, writers, celebrities, everybody from Mark Ruffalo to Jane Lynch to more politicians to Congress people. And of course, we love talking to you guys as well, too. And I appreciate all the comments that we have on there today. All right. So you can watch this again if you just joined in late. You want to see it from the beginning. We will be broadcasting it again on our Twitter feed, which is at Really American One. And you can also find it on at Chip Franklin, too. You guys be well. We'll talk to you again soon. Thanks again.